Question, perhaps off topic, but I've always wondered about Matthias.
Oh yeah,
The apostles seem to have decided to draw lots
yeah,
for a replacement for Judas, not God. Is
yeah,
it possible it was Paul who was God's?
yeah.
That's a good question.
Yeah, we can go to Acts chapter 1 and we can answer that. Um, the key word for understanding this is the word numbered. In Acts chapter 1 and going down at verse 15 gives actually we just talked about this on Sunday at our church, but Peter stands up and he says the phrase, the word numbered, um, and he talks about the fact that Judas was numbered with them, in meaning 12. Verse 17, for he was numbered with us. So that tells us that Judas was legitimate. The Lord did pick him, and apparently Judas left the group. Judas's heart got the best of him, and he thought he could make a quick buck. Perhaps he didn't think they'd actually arrest Jesus. It seems like when he saw them actually arrest him and it started progressing, that's when he said, whoa, 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 threw the money down and couldn't believe that he betrayed the Lord that way, and he couldn't live with it. Um, but anyway, he says in verse 17, he was numbered with us. He obtained a part of this ministry. Now, through that, Judas apparently threw the money down, the 30 pieces of silver, which is about a month's wages or so. And apparently, they went and bought a field with that money. And that's the same place that Judas hung himself. I believe probably at the earthquake of Jesus's death, there was an earthquake. More than likely, the rope or whatever he used broke out of the tree, and apparently he also landed on the ground and his bowels gushed out. It says in verse 18. So that field became known as the field of blood in verse 19, and then they go to replace him, and it says that they have a part of the um, what's it called? What am I trying to say? Requirements in verse number 22 is that they had to be a witness with us of his resurrection. This is very, very important in verse 22, because there are people like the Mormons, for example. The Mormons, the Church of Latter-day Saints, they would say that they are the true and accurate church today, because they say you have to have apostles to be a legitimate church. So they always replace their apostles and they keep the apostleship going through appointments. But here in verse 22, one of the requirements to become an apostle was to be a witness of his resurrection. So that limits how long the apostolic age can be, because as people die off, they aren't witnesses. So they appointed two. It says here Joseph and Matthias. Now, what they did was um, they used an Old Testament or an Old Covenant principle, something they were very familiar with, and they did what they called casting lots. In other words, they threw some kind of an object up into the air, heads, tails, kind of like for us, and they're throwing it up into the heavens as if to say, God, you decide, this is in your hands. And they believed that whatever the answer was, whatever it landed on, was the Lord's will for their life. Now, whether you can say, that's not how I would do it or not, that's what they did. And the cultural context was in verse 26 that the lot fell on Matthias. And then here's the key phrase in verse 26 to answer the second half of the question. He was numbered with the 11. So if you go over to Revelation 21 and you see in Revelation 21 that the foundation of the new Jerusalem is the 12 foundations of the apostles. Or I'm sorry, do I have that backwards? The 12 foundations are the tribes, and then the well, let me just look at it now before I get it wrong. Revelation 21, sorry about that. Um,
I do it all the time.
it's one of those two. Let me see real quick. Okay, verse 12 had a high wall, 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. The names written thereon, the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. Okay, there's the gates. And if we go down a bit further, verse 19, and the foundations of the wall were garnished with, and they name all these things. Where's the name of the apostles? I may have passed it. Well, anyways, having said that, I'll find it real quick here. Everybody's probably seeing it at
That's all
home.
right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the names of the 12 apostles. And you put those two thoughts together, you have Matthias numbered with them in Acts chapter 1, meaning that the apostle Paul was an apostle, but he wasn't one of the 12 apostles. So that means that his name would not be part of the Revelation 21 group.
Here it is. It's Revelation 21:14. It took me a
Oh, there
minute
we go.
too. Yeah.
12 foundations. That's what it is. It's the foundations.
Okay, so wait, Matthias was an apostle, we
Yes.
believe, from God.
Oh, yeah, for
Though
sure.
they cast their lot, that's because it was a cultural thing.
For sure. They believe that to be the spiritual thing to do, and they left it up to the Lord. See, Paul was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. The 12 were called to be an apostle to Israel,
to the
to the
to the
Jews.
Jews.
They were finishing the Daniel 9 prophecy of bringing the gospel to the Jews. And so that time period didn't go up until and after the death of Stephen in Acts 8. That may have been a lot of information just now, but at the end of Acts 8, when Stephen dies, that
When he's stoned?
concludes. Yes,
Yeah.
when he dies, that gets us to the approximate. Everybody's saying what verse? Yes, see, I knew everybody saw it. That gets us to the approximate 490-year prophecy from when the time clock started, when King Artaxerxes told them to rebuild the temple.
Wow.
So 490 years later gets us to Acts chapter 8. Okay. Now, Acts chapter, so if you could look up Acts 9, let me show you how powerful this is. Remember, the prophecy is to the house of Israel, the city of Jerusalem. As soon as Stephen dies in Acts 8, it says this in Acts 9:1. And Saul, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughters against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest, desiring him a letter to Damascus and to the synagogues. But if he found any of them this way, whether they were men or women, he bring them bound to Jerusalem. Do you know what their response was to that? They hightailed it out of there, and they were gone. And they all left. And from that moment on, they all left out of fear that Paul was going to persecute them. So the Christians in Jerusalem, that the Daniel 9 prophecy was to. So for 490 years, God focused on the salvation of Israel, the lost sheep of the house of Israel. But when those 490 years were up, Jerusalem is the only place you read about in Acts chapters 1 through 8. But as soon as that 490-year prophecy is up, Stephen is killed, and because of that, they're so scared they leave and they go boom. They go international, and then the gospel goes international from Acts chapter 9, and they're scattered, and the gospel goes ballistic international. So Paul, my point is, Paul gets saved in Acts chapter 9. He's an apostle, but to the Gentiles. There's like another chapter starting. The 12 were for that 490-year period, is my point there.
Just wondering the other day if Matthias wasn't seemingly significant after being cast as Judas's replacement. So glad that that question got answered.
Yeah, I think you have to also understand that Matthias doesn't get mentioned, but you don't really read much about a lot of them. When you
It's
get
true.
into the book of Acts, we really only read about 3 of them. So it's not that the other, 8 or, whatever are insignificant. That's not the focus of the story. So
Very
you can't
true.
you can't go by number of times mentioned that they weren't significant. It just wasn't recorded by Luke.